Hello everyone. In this class, we are going to solve the remaining questions of the Antenet June 2019 paper. So in the last class, we have solved this question, and in this question, we are given that the bandwidth of the network is 10 megabits per second. So when we see this small b, that means bits, and capital B usually means bytes. So we have 10 megabits per second of bandwidth, and it is saying that we have a station, and this station is passing 12,000 frames per minute, and it is given that the size of each frame is 10,000 bits. This means that this station is generating how much. So throughput simply means that how much data this particular station is generating per second, right? So you can see here it is generating 12,000 frames per minute. This means that it is generating 12,000. If we convert the frames into bits, so we will see that the size of each frame is 10,000 bits. Okay, so we can say 10k bits. So 10,000 bits we will multiply here, and this is given in per minutes. We can convert this into seconds. So when we convert this into seconds, we will get 200 into 10 to the power 4, that is 2 into 10 to the power 6 bits per second, or you can say 2 megabits per second. So this is the throughput of the network. From here you can also find out the efficiency, and efficiency is simply nothing but the throughput and out of the bandwidth. So for example, the throughput is 2 into 10 to the power 6. This is the data this station is passing, and the total data that this station can pass, that is the total bandwidth available, is 10 into 10 to the power 6 bits per second, right? So this means that if we find out the efficiency in percentage, this will come out to be 20%. This means that efficiency is 20%, means that the network is not using the full capability. It is only using 20% of the capability the network can use. So network can use 10 megabits per second. That means network is capable of generating 10 megabits per second, but the station is generating only 2 into 10 to the power 6 bit per second. Then the next question is, how many reflexive relations are there on a set with 4 elements? To solve this question, you should be aware of the relation matrix. So we can make the matrix for any relation. For example, we are given a relation, and let us say in this relation is on a set from A to A, and let us say inside the set A we have 3 elements A, B and C. Okay, so this relation is on A, B, C and A, B, C, and let us say the relation is some relation, and in this relation we have the pairs like this. So A is related to B, and let us say B is related to A, and A is related to C, and let us say B is related to C. This is the relation. So how we can make the relation matrix for this particular relation is this. So the relation matrix, in this we will have 3 rows and 3 columns. Okay, so this will be simple. So in this we will have the entries 0 and 1. So how we will put the entries, that will depend on how the elements are related to each other. So for example, we have 3 elements. So you will see that A and B are relation. So A related, no, so that means 0. AB related, yes, so yes, AB is in the relation, so it will be 1. AC is in the relation, yes, AC is also in the relation. Then BA is in the relation, yes, BA is in the relation. BB is in the relation, no, so BC is in the relation, yes. Then CA in the relation, no. CB in the relation, no. CC in the relation, no. So this will be the relation matrix for this. So if you understood this relation matrix, from this you can find out how many reflexive relations are there. What is the meaning of reflexive relation? So a relation is called as reflexive if all the elements in the set are related to itself. For example, we have 3 elements in the set, then this relation will be called as reflexive relation, AA, BB and CC. So when all the elements are related to itself, that is called as reflexive relation. You will notice that in case of reflexive relation, we will have ones in the diagonal. So for example, let us say these are the 3 elements ABC and ABC, right? Now AA need to be in the relation, so this needs to be 1. AB may be in the relation or may not be in the relation. That means it is having 2 choice, either relation AB in the relation or AB is not in the relation, that is 0 or 1. Like this, for AC also we have two choices, either it can be 0 or it can be 1. 0 means that AC is not in the relation, 1 means AC is in the relation. And then BA is also having two choices, either it can be 0 or it can be 1, but BB does not have a choice, they have to be in the relation if the relation needs to be reflexive, right? So BC may be in the relation or may not be in the relation. Same thing with the CA may be in the relation or may not be in the relation, right? So like this, you have so this last element needs to be 1 because CC needs to be in the relation if the relation needs to be reflexive. So you will see that there are total 3 into 3, that is 9 entries in this relation, right? There are total 3 to the power 2 entries, that is total 9 entries are there. And out of these 9 entries, you will see that these 3 entries do not have any choice, right? These 3 entries do not have any choice. So this means that these 3 elements do not have any choice, means that, so total you can have in this relation, you will see that there are total number of entries are 3 to the power 2, and out of these entries 6 entries are having the choice and 3 entries do not have any choice. That means total number of reflexive relation can be 6 for 3 elements, right? Total number of reflexive relation can be 3 to the power 2 minus 3, right? And you can do so, each element is having two choices, so we have made a mistake here, that is every element is having two choices, so this will be 2 to the power 6. So because every element is having two choices, so you can see how these 2 to the power 6 relations will be. There will be, let me show you one relation which will be reflexive. Let's call this R1. So in this relation we can with AA and BB and CC as mandatory. Okay, they are mandatory in the relation. Then out of these pairs, these 6 pairs, any pair can be there, for example AB. So this will make one reflexive relation. Then you can take second reflexive relation, in which you will take all these elements plus you can take any other element, let us say BA. So like this you will be having total 64 reflexive relations. So in general we can say that, what we can say that, let us say if we have a relation, if we have a set A in which we have n elements, okay, the cardinality of set is n, that is total number of elements are n. So you will see that in this matrix we will be having n square elements, right? In this, for example, if we have 3 elements in the set, then there are 9 entries. If we will have n elements, then there will be n square entries. And out of the n square entries, you will see that the n entries do not have any choice, right? For example, in this case, three entries do not have any choice. So n square minus n elements do not have any choice. So these many elements will be having two choices. So n square minus n number of elements will be having two choices, either they can be included in the reflexive relation or they may not be included. So number of reflexive relation with n elements is, number of reflexive relations with n elements will be 2 to the power n square minus n. Now in this question you are given that you have 4 elements. So 4 elements, that means the value of n is 4. So you can put directly here. So this will be 4 square minus 4, that is 16 minus 4 will be 12. So 2 to the power 12 reflexive relations are possible with 4 elements. Same thing you can try with the symmetric relations. You can find out how many symmetric relation can be there. In case of symmetric relation, if AB is in the relation, then BA also needs to be in the relation. That means the lower triangle matrix will be equal to the upper triangle matrix. Okay, this is a good practice to do by yourself. You try to find out number of irreflexive relations. You try to find out number of symmetric relations. Irreflexive relation means that none of the elements will be related to each other. So next question is, if we are given a grammar in which number of we have v number of variables, v is the variables and t is the terminals, s is the starting symbol and p is the number of production. In p we have the p is the set of the productions. It is a context free grammar without null production or unit production. Let k be the maximum number of symbols on the right side of any production. Okay, so they are saying that k is the maximum number of symbols on the right side of any production in p. The maximum number of production rules for any equivalent grammar in Chomsky normal form. So when we talk about CNF is a normalized form of a context-free grammar, just like GNF. So we have two normal forms, that is CNF and GNF. In case of CNF, the production rules can be only in this form, that is A tends to, so either two variables can be on the right hand side or a single terminal can be on the side. Okay, so either two variables or a single terminal. This kind of grammar are called as uh, Chomsky normal form grammar. So they are saying that if you are given a grammar which is a context free grammar, let us say we have some grammar like this, x, y, and capital Y, and let us say capital Y tends to x, z, capital Z, and let us say z tends to x, y. Okay, so something like this we have a grammar. So in this here they are saying that k is the maximum number of symbols on the right hand side of any production. So you will see that in this case the value of k will be 3. That is, maximum number of symbols are 3 on the right hand side of any production. That is the meaning of k. Now they are asking how many production rules will be there if we convert this grammar into the Chomsky normal form grammar. And for that we have a direct proof, and the formula for that is k minus 1 into the number of productions. So these signs are representing the number of production, that is the cardinality of the production set, plus number of terminals. So this is the maximum number of production rules can be in the CNF, equivalent CNF. This is the maximum. That means we can have the less number of production. For example, if you convert this grammar into the CNF grammar, let's see how we can convert this grammar into the CNF grammar. So we have x tends to xy capital Y, and we need to convert in this form, that is either two variables can be in the right hand side or a single terminal can be. So let's take a new production rule, that is x tends to x, and let's take we have a y tends to y. Okay, so these are the two production rules we have taken. Now we can replace x and y with x dash and y dash. So the new production rule which we are taking should be in the CNF normal form. So this production rule, the first production rule will become x tends to x dash, y dash, and y. Still it is not in the CNF. So what we can do is we can take another production rule, let us say y double dash, and we can call it x dash y dash. Okay, so the new production rule which you are taking should also be in the CNF. So this production rule is in the CNF. Now we can put x tends to y, x dash y dash, y double dash. So this production rule becomes x tends to y double dash and y. So now this production rule is in the CNF, right? Same thing we can do with the second production rule. In this let's take, so we have y tends to x small z and capital Z. So these two are making the problem. X dash we have already taken as x, so instead of x we can put x dash, and z dash, let's take z dash tends to z, right? So this production rule becomes, so instead of x we will put x dash, and in place of z we will put z dash, and then we have capital Z. Now this production rule is not in CNF, so what we can do is we can take another production, let us say z double dash, and we can call it x dash z dash. So now we can put this z double dash here. So this production rule becomes y tends to z double dash z. So now this production rule is in the CNF. Now the next production rule is z tends to xy. We have already taken x dash tends to x and y dash tends to y, so we can put it here, and this production rule becomes z tends to x dash y dash. So now this production rule is also in CNF. You can see how many production rules are coming when we are converting this grammar into CNF. So this is the first production rule, then second production rule, right? Then we have converted this production rule. So this is not a production rule in the grammar now, because we have reduced this production rule to this particular production rule, right? So this is the third production rule, and we have taken x tends to x dash y dash as y double dash, right? So y double dash is this. That means next we will be having this particular production rule, that is x tends to y double dash and y. This is the fourth production rule. Then this is the fifth production rule. Okay, this is the sixth production rule, and this is your seventh production rule, and this is eighth production rule. So total you have 8 production rules when you convert this grammar into the CNF grammar. And let's try to do this with this formula. So value of k is equal to 3, because total number of maximum number of symbols on the right hand side of any production is 3. So 3 minus 1, and then number of production rules in your original grammar is 3, right? Plus total number of terminals are, we have x, y, and z. So small letters are called as terminals, and capital letters are called as variables or non-terminals. Okay, so in this we are using three terminals. So this will be, so 3 minus 1 is 2, 2 into 3 is 6, 6 plus 3 is 9. So maximum number of production rules can be 9 and we are getting 8. So that because this is maximum, so you can get the number of production rules less than this or equal to this, but you will never get the production rules greater than equal to this, greater than this. So this will be the right answer, and you can prove this by taking any example like this. Next question is on ways. The first method and the easiest method of solving this question is, if you have lots of time, if 15 to 20 minutes remaining in your examination and you have solved all the questions, then you can straightforward do this question. They are asking you that if a is equal to 7 and b is equal to 17 and n is equal to 561, then what will be the value of a to the power b using mod n? Okay, so this is modular arithmetic. So the first way and the easiest way is you can multiply 7 17 times because it's a to the power b, and then you can divide by 561, and whatever remainder you will get, that will be your answer. Okay, so that is the first way, but it will take lots of time. The second method of solving this question is using this information. This method will also take lot of time. You will be confused. This information is giving only to confuse you, so that you can keep dividing 7 to the power 17 like this, and you try and you will be stuck. There is one more technical way of solving this question, and that is using two theorems, very popular theorem, that is called as Fermat's Little theorem and Chinese remainder theorem. Let us see, try solve this question by this third approach, because in the first two approaches you will not learn anything. In this third approach you will learn some things. So let us see using the third method, that is using these these two theorems. So Fermat theorem says that, it says very simple thing. It is saying that if, let us say, a is a positive integer, if a is positive integer, so greater than equal to 1, right? And let us say p is a prime number. If p is a prime number, then what we can say is, directly we can say that if you take a to the power p minus 1, you will always get 1 using mod p. Okay, so p is a prime number, remember this. So a to the power p minus 1 is equal to 1 mod p. That is the same thing as saying that a to the power p minus 1, okay, a to the power p minus 1 mod p will be equal to 1. Okay, these two are the same thing, so do not be confused about this. These two are actually same thing. They are simply saying that if you take the a to the power p minus 1, you will always get 1. If you divide by p, you will get 1 remainder. So you can prove this equation by taking any two very small numbers. Let's take a any positive integer and p is any prime number. So let us take 3. So 3 is a prime number, right? So if you do 2 to the power p minus 1 will be 2, because p is 3, so p minus 1 will be 2. So 2 to the power 3 minus 1, and if you take mod with 3, that is mod p, then you will get 1 as remainder. So you can see 4 divided by 3, you will get 1 remainder, right? 4 mod 3 is 1. You can take any values of a. Let's take a equals to 4 and p equals to some 7. 7 is a prime number. Again you can try 4 to the power 7 minus 1 mod p will always be 1, right? So 4 to the power 7 minus means that 4 to the power 6 mod p is equal to 1. Mod p means p, the value of p is 7 here. So 4 to the power 6 is nothing but, I think, 4096. So 4096 mod 7 will be equal to 1. You can try dividing 4096 by 7, and you will see that the answer will always be, remainder will be 1. So 7 5 is 35, and then 5 9 7 8 is 56, and 3 6, that is 7 5 is 35. So you are getting 1 remainder, right? So this theorem is great, that this theorem is good. Then we have the second theorem, that is called as Chinese remainder theorem. Okay, Chinese remainder theorem says very simple thing. It says that if, let us say, you have any number n, okay, and let us say n is some number, let's say this is 30. Okay, n is some number 30, and if you want to find out, let us say a to the power b mod 30. Let's take 2 to the power 40 mod 30. We need to find out. Okay, what it will be. It will take lots of time to solve this question, but this question can be solved very easy using these two theorems. Okay, so first theorem is Fermat's little theorem. What your Chinese remainder theorem says is that it says, if let us say you have any number a1 and you take mod operation with, let us say, n1, and then you have another number a2, you take mod operation with n2, and let us say like this you keep doing, and let us say for k integers we do this mod nk. So the solution of these equations will be x equals to m mod n, capital N, and this capital is nothing but the LCM of all these numbers, that is n1 n2, all these numbers, LCM of all these numbers. And one more thing to remember here is that all these a1 a2 ak, all these are positive integers which are greater than 1. Okay, they must be greater than 1 and they must be positive integers. That means it is true for only 2 to onwards. And all these ni's, that is n1 n2 nk, are co-primes, pairwise co-prime. Pairwise co-prime means that if you take any pair of these numbers, they should have only the common divisor as 1 or the number itself. Okay, what I mean to say is, for example, look at this. If you take the factors of n 30, that is factors of 30 will be 2, 3 and 5, right? All these are prime numbers. So pairwise, that means यहाँ पर in this case the value of n1 is 2 and the value of n2 is 3 and the value of n3 is 5. Okay, if you take the LCM of 2, 3, 5, you will get 30, that is you will get n. So n is the LCM of n1, n2 and n3, and all these are co-primes, pairwise co-prime. Pairwise co-prime means that 2 and 3 are co-prime. We say that two numbers are co-primes when their divisor is either the number itself or 1. That means there is no other divisor. What I mean to say is that 2 and 6 are not co-primes because their common divisor is 2 and 1 and the number itself. So there should not be any other number that is that can divide these two numbers. For example, 2 and 3 are co-primes because the number which can divide these two numbers is only the number itself or the 1, right? So the common divisor is 1 only. So the common divisor of the number should be 1. So 2, 3 common divisor is 1. 3, 5 common divisor is 1. 2, 5 common divisor is 1. So they are co-primes, right? So by using this theorem, now we can solve this question. So we have 2 to the power 40 mod 30. What we can do is, if we say, because we have 2 and 3 and 5, so first let us see, using the Fermat's theorem, we can say that 2 to the power 2 will be equal to 1 mod 3, right? If 2 to the power 2 is equal to 1, using mod 3, using the Fermat's theorem, that is a to the power p minus 1 equal to 1 mod p. So p is here 3 and a is 2. Using the same theorem, we can say that if we have 2 to the power 40 mod 30, right? So we are taking first with the 2, then 3, then 5. So if we take using mod 3, so this will be 2 to the power 40 mod 3 can be written as, so 2 to the power 40 can be written as 2 to the power 2 into 2 to the power 2 into 2 to the power 2, like this 20 times, right? We can write 20 times like this, 2 to the power 2 and mod 3. Then this can be written as 2 to the power 2 mod 3, 2 to the power 2 mod 3, like this 20 times, and all of these will be 1. That means 2 to the power 40 mod 3 will always give you 1, right? And same thing you can try with this, that is if you take with number 2, so we have taken with 3, so that means we have find out that 2 to the power 40 mod 3 is equal to 1. Then if you take with 2, so 2 is a prime number or not? Yes, I think 2 is a prime number. Yes, 2 is a prime number. So you can take 2 here, and p minus 1, so a to the power p minus 1, that is 2 to the power 40. If you take 2 to the power 1 will be mod, so 2 to the power 1 mod 2 will give you 0. So that means we cannot take 2 here. So 2 is not, I think 2 is not a prime number. So for this it is not working, but for our question it will work. So in our question what we need to find out is, the main idea behind this theorem is that, so try to understand the solution of the question which we need to find out. So we need to find out the value of 7 to the power 17 mod 561. So the step 1 should be, you should divide 561, and you should need to find out the factor of 561. So this will be 187, then it will be 17, and then 17. All these are prime numbers. Okay, so this will work only when n1, n2, nk are prime numbers. So 3, 11, 17 are prime numbers, right? So what we can do is, we can write this equation as, so first we need to find out the value of 7 to the power 17 mod 3, then 7 to the power 17 mod 11, 7 to the power 17 mod 17. Then we can find out the value of what they will give. So we know that if we find out 7 to the power 2 mod 3, so 7 to the power 2 mod 3 will always be 1, right? Because p is equal to 3 here, so p minus 1 is 2. So we have seen using the Fermat's theorem. And we can use the same concept to extend and to find out the value of 7 to the power 17 mod 3. So 7 to the power 17 can be written as 7 into 7 to the power 16, okay, and then mod 3, right? So we have written 7 to the power 17 as 7 into 7 to the power 16, and 7 to the power 16 can further be divided, and it can be written as 7 to the power 2 into 7 to the power 2 into 7 to the power 2, like this, 8 times, right? 8 into 2 is 16, so this will become 7 to the power 16 if we do this 8 times, and that will be mod 3. And you know that 7 to the power 2 mod 3 is equal to 1, so this will become 7 to the power 2 mod 3 into 7 to the power 2 mod 3 into 7 to the power 2 mod 3, so this will become 1. So in the end we will left with 7 mod 3, and you know that 7 mod 3 is equal to 1. So this means that 7 to the power 17 mod will give you equal to 1 using mod 3, right? The second part is, we need to check with 11. So if we need to find out 7 to the power 17 mod 11, so that we can use the Chinese remainder theorem. So 7 to the power, we know that 7 to the power 10 mod 11 will be equal to 1 using the Fermat's theorem, where p is equal to 11, so p minus 1 will be 10. We can use this theorem by, so we can write it as, so 7, we need to find out the value 7 to the power 17 mod 11. So 7 to the power 17 mod 11 can be written as 7 to the power 7 into 7 to the power 10 mod 11, and this can be written as 7 to the power 7 mod 11 into 7 to the power 10 mod 11, and 7 to the power 10 mod 11 is 1 using the Fermat's theorem, so this will become 7 to the power 7 mod 11, right? And 7 to the power 7 can further be divided, and we can write it as 7 to the power 3 mod 11 and into 7 to the power 3 mod 11 into 7 to the power 1 mod 11, right? So this will become 3 plus 3 6 plus 1 7, 7 to the power 7 mod 11. We have simply divided this. 7 to the power 3 mod 11 will be 2. You can try. 7 to the power 3 will be, I think, 343 mod 11. So 7 to the power 3 mod 11 will be 2, then 7 to the power 3 mod 11 will be 2, and 7 mod 11 will be 7. So this will become 28 mod 11, right? So this will become 28 mod 11. So 28 mod 11 will be, it will be 6, right? So we have find out that 7 to the power 17 is equal to 6 using mod 11. Same thing we need to find out for 17. Okay, so 17, for the 17 it is very easy. We need to find out 7 to the power 17 using mod 17. So using Fermat's theorem, we can say that 7 to the power 16 mod 17 will be equal to 1. right? Where p is equal to 17, so p minus 1 is 16. This 7 to the power 17 can be written as 7 into 7 to the power 16 mod 17 and then mod 17 equal to, so 7 to the power 16 mod 17 is 1. So we have, now we are left with 7 mod 11 and that will be 7. So this means that we have find out 7 to the power 17 is equal to 7 mod 11, right? So now we have our three equation, that is if you do 7 to the power 17 with mod 11 you will get 7. If you do 7 to the power 17 mod 11, so this is 17, so this is 17. Okay, so 7 to the power 17 will be 6 using mod 11 and 7 to the power 17 will be 1 using mod 3. Simply means that this problem becomes the same problem that is your Chinese remainder theorem. Chinese remainder theorem says that x equals to, you will get a1 mod n1, okay, x equals to a2 mod n2 and x equals to a3 mod n3, right? So you have find out that आपने a1 की वैल्यू फाइंड आउट कर ली, बिकॉज नाउ यू हैव थ्री इक्वेशन, दैट इज you have 7 to the power 17 is equal to 1 using mod 3, right? Then you have 7 to the power 17 is equal to 6 using mod 11 and you have third equation, that is 7 to the power 17 is equal to 7 using mod 13. Okay, if you compare now with Chinese remainder theorem, in this you are getting that a1 is equal to 1, a2 is equal to 6 and a3 is equal to 7 and n1 is equal to 3, n2 is equal to 11 and n3 equals to 17. This is 17. Okay, so this means that you just need to find out the value of x. X is a number, so x is a number, so we need to find out the value of x. We get 1 when we divide that by 3, so remainder will be 1 when we divide by 3 and we get 6 when we divide by 11, that is it is 6 mod 11 and it is 7 mod 17. So you just need to find out a number जिसको आप अगर 3 से डिवाइड करो तो एक रिमाइंडर आए, 11 से डिवाइड करो तो 6 रिमाइंडर आए और 17 से डिवाइड करो तो 7 रिमाइंडर आए. बिकॉज दिस इज ऑब्जेक्टिव क्वेश्चन, सो यू कैन डायरेक्टली try with the options. For example, if we divide 160 by 3, we will get the remainder, so we will get the remainder 1. If we divide by 11, we will get the remainder 6, and if we divide by 17, we will get the remainder, so with 17 we will get the remainder 10, I think, yes, or something else. So 17 into 9 is 153, so you will get the remainder 7. Okay, so this is matching here, 160 is matching. Okay, so first option is itself is matching. You can see here x is equal to, we need to find out the value of x in our answer, so x is equal to 160. You can see if you divide 160 by 3, you will get the remainder 1, right? Because this will be 10 and then, so you are getting the remainder 1. If you divide 160 by 11, you will get the answer so I think this is 1 and then you are getting 50. So you are getting the remainder 6, right? And if you divide 160 by 17, you will get the remainder 7. So 160 is the right answer. Okay, now the next question is on the addressing modes. In this question, what they are asking is, they are saying that instruction is stored at the location 500 with its address field at location 501. So we have instruction something like this. it is stored at the location 500. Okay, here the instruction is stored, and the address part of the instruction is stored at the 501. Okay, so 501 is address part of the instruction is stored. The address field has the value 400, so inside this we have the value 400. A processor register R1 contains a number 200. Match the addressing modes given below with the effective address for the instruction. One more thing to notice here is that, so this instruction is stored on the 2 bytes, that is 500 and 501. So next instruction will be at the location 502. That means program counter will be pointing to the location 502. This will be useful in case of PC relative addressing mode. Now when we talk about direct addressing mode, in case of direct addressing mode, the address is given in the address part of the instruction. For example, load 500. So this instruction, this is the address part of the instruction which specify the address of the operand. So directly the address is given in the address part of the instruction, that is called as direct addressing mode. So this means that in case of direct addressing mode, the address of the operand will be 400. Register indirect addressing mode. In case of register indirect addressing mode, the instruction will be something like this: load @R1. So this simply means that first you will go to the register R1. Inside the register R1 you will find the address of the operand. That means address of the operand is directly not given in the instruction. You will have to first access the register R1, inside which you will find the address of the operand. So according to register indirect addressing mode, the address of the operand will be 200. Then index with R1 as the index register. So if in the index register we have the instruction something like this, so the instruction is, let us say, something like this, and we have to use the index register, that is R1 as index register. So in the indexed addressing mode, the effective address will be the address part of the instruction plus the value inside the register, that is 400 plus 200, that will be 600. That is according to index register addressing mode, this will be the right answer. Then relative addressing mode. So in relative addressing mode, what we do is we use the program counter. So relative addressing mode is similar to your indexed addressing mode. The difference is that in this case we will not use the register R1, we will use the program counter as the index register. Okay, so effective address will be the address part of the instruction plus the program counter value. Program counter value is 502. That means the effective address will be 902. That is 2, right? According to this you can match your answer. So A is matching with 3. So this is the only option which is matching. Register indirect is matching with, B is matching with 1, C is matching with 4. That is right. Okay. Now which of the following class of IP addresses that has the last address as this one? Okay, which of the following classes of IP addresses? So if you do not know about the classful IP addressing, in classful IP addressing, the whole address part, the whole IP addresses, that is all the 2 to the power 32 IP addresses are divided into 5 classes. So if you talk about class A, the range of the class A is from 0 to 127. The addresses which start from 0 to 127 belongs to class A. And in case of class B, the address range is 128 to 191. Then in class C, the range is 192 to 223. Then in class D, the range is, I think, 224 to 239. And according to class E, the range is 240 to 255. So this is the range of the class. This means, so when we are talking about this range, that means we are talking about the first octet of the IP address. So IP address is something like this. Let us say 127.19.16.190. Let us say this is the IP address. IP address is divided into 4 parts, and these are called as octets. And each octet is of 8 bits. So in 8 bits we can represent from 0 to 255. That means the minimum range of the IP address can be 0000, and maximum range can be 255, 255, 255 and 25. This is the maximum IP address which is used for the broadcast, and this is the first IP address which is used for DSCP address, right? So these are 2 special addresses, and this is the range. So you see we have 223. So 223 means that it is belonging to class C. Which of the following is not needed by an encryption algorithm used in cryptography? So when we talk about encryption algorithm, it is encrypted something like this. So we have two kind of encryption algorithm, that is symmetric key cryptography and public key cryptography. Symmetric is also called as uh, your private key cryptography or symmetric key cryptography. So we take the message, we apply the encryption algorithm, and encryption algorithm will use a key. Let's say we are using the private key cryptography, so it will use the private key to encrypt the message. Then after encrypting the message will become the cipher text. So encrypted message is called as cipher text. Then we will transmit it to some secure communication medium to receiver. On the receiver we will get the cipher text. On the cipher text we will apply the decryption algorithm, and decryption algorithm will be using the same private key. So we are talking about the symmetric key cryptography, and then we will get the message. So receiver will get the message. So this is the receiver side and this is the sender side. On the sender side we do the encryption, on the receiver side we do the decryption. So key is required, message is also required, cipher text is there, but user details are not required in the cryptography. Then next question is, in a B tree each node represents a disk block. Okay, so we have studied about the B tree if you remember in database management system. And B tree, if you talk about the internal node of the B tree, so in the internal node of the B tree we store, what do we store? We store keys and their pointers. For example, key 1 record pointer 1. Okay, then we store key 2 record pointer 2, like this, and these are the block pointers. So if you have two keys, then there will be three record pointers, there will be three block pointers. That is called as the order of the tree. Order means maximum number of child pointers we can have in a tree. So we see that the node of a B tree stores, it stores k minus 1 keys, right? It stores k minus 1 record pointers, and it stores k so k minus 1 record pointers, and it stores let us say k block pointers if k is the order of the tree, right? Let's say k is the order of the tree, and it should be less than or equal to the block size, because we want to fit each node into one block, right? It should be less than equal to block size. In this given, it is given that the block size is 8192 bytes. Each key uses 32 bytes, that is the value of keys, the value of the size of the key is 32 bytes. And in a B tree of order m, so in this instead of k it is given m, there are m minus 1 keys. So we know that since each branch is on another disk block, we assume that the branch is of 4 bytes. So they are giving you that the block pointer, or you can say branch, the block pointer is of 4 bytes. The total memory requirement for a non-leaf node means internal node. So they are asking about the internal node. So you are given that the order is m, right? If the order is m, there will be m minus 1 keys. Now you will see one thing, that the record pointer size is not given. So we'll take record pointer size equal to 0. Okay, record pointer size we will take as 0. So we have m minus 1 keys, and the size of each key is 32 bytes. Plus we have k minus 1 record pointer. So because record pointer is 0, so this will become 0, because record pointer value is not given. Then we have m into block pointer, that is of 4 bytes, and that should be less than equal to the block size, that is 8192 bytes, right? So this is asking about the total memory requirements. So we need to find out the value of only this one. So how much memory is required to store one node, and each node will store this information. So this will be 32m minus 32 plus 4m, right? So this will become 32m plus 4m is 36m minus 32. So 36m minus 32 will be the right answer. Now next upcoming 5 questions are on software engineering, and these questions are really important, really very simple questions. I think they cannot ask any more simple questions from software engineering. So they are saying that we are given a flow graph, and what is the cyclic complexity of this graph. So cyclomatic complexity can be find in three ways. So first thing is that the cyclomatic complexity is a software matrix that will measure the quantitative, or you can say logical complexity of the program. What we mean to say by logical complexity is that how many conditions we need to check that the whole graph is covered. So first method of finding out the cyclomatic complexity is that what we can do is we can find out the total number of regions. So cyclomatic complexity is equal to number of regions in the graph. Number of regions in graph. Okay, remember bounded and unbounded both kind of regions. What I mean to say by region is, for example, this graph is given. Okay, in this graph we have three regions. One region is this, one region is this, and then we have the outer region, right? This one. There are total three regions, and there are two bounded regions and one unbounded region. So total number of region is three. So from first method you need to find out the number of regions. So you will say this is the first region of the graph, then second region is this, then this is the third region of the graph, and this is the fourth region of the graph. That means there are four regions in the graph. Second method is that that is also using the formula of your number of regions. Number of regions in a graph is equal to e minus n plus 2. Okay, where is the number of edges, n is the number of nodes. So e minus n, that is the number of edges. If you see how many edges are there, you will see that 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11. There are 11 edges, and number of nodes are how many? 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9. So there are 9 vertices, or you can say nodes. So if you apply e minus n plus 2, again you will get the same answer, that is 11 minus 9 plus 2, that is you will get 4. So type cyclomatic complexity is 4. Then we have one more method of finding out the cyclomatic complexity, and the method 3 is that we can find out how many predicate conditions are there. Okay, how many conditions are there in the graph, and we can simply add 1 with that. So number of condition plus 1. So P is nothing but total number of predicate nodes. Number of predicate nodes. Predicate means node means that the nodes in which we are checking the condition. Predicate means condition. So how you will identify the predicate nodes? For example, let us say this is the graph. Okay, this is the first statement of the program. Then this is the second statement of the program. And if there are two branches going out of a node, that means this is a conditional node, or you can say predicate node. Let us say 3 and 5. Okay, so this means that if the condition 2 is true, then we will go to 3, otherwise we will go to 5. Okay, so this will be a true branch and this will be a false branch. And you can see that the number of predicate nodes are this. For example, this is a predicate node because there are two branches going out of this particular node. And you will see that this node is also a predicate node because there are two branches going out of this node, right? So this branch and this branch, this is also a predicate node. Then you will see that we have any other predicate node. So we can see 1 is also a predicate node because from 1 we are giving two branches. Either we can go from 1 to 2 3, or we can go from 1 to 11. So there are two branches in this. So 1 is also a predicate node. Now there is no other node from which we have two outgoing edges. So there is no node. That means number of predicate nodes in this is 3, right? Number of predicate nodes are 3. So this means that the cyclomatic complexity of this graph is p plus 1, that is 3 plus 1, which is 4. Again you are getting the same cyclomatic complexity. Let us try to understand this with a question and try to draw the graph for that question. Let us say we have a program in which the first statement is if a less than b, then call the function f1, else this is the third statement. The third statement is you need to check again. Okay, third statement is check if a is less than c. Okay, So if a is less than c, then call the function f2, the fourth statement. And then again, if the condition is false here, else call the function f3. Okay, so this is your program in which you have 5 statements. How you can make the graph for this particular program? So I have given the names to the statement number. The first statement is a conditional node, right? This is a predicate node because we are checking a condition. So from this we can go to two statements. Either we can go to the statement number 2. If the condition true, then we go to the statement number 2. That means we will call this function. If the statement is false, then again we are having a conditional node. That is a statement number 3 is also a predicate node. From the statement number 3, either we can go to the statement number 4 if the condition is true, right? If the condition is true, then you will call the function f2. Otherwise you will call the function f3, like this. So how many regions are there in this program? Or so the from second node, if the condition is directly, so you can directly go to the statement number 6, right, when the program will be completed. So program may also be completed after 2, which means that if this condition is true, if the condition is true, then you will not have to go to this particular third statement. If you do not need to go to third statement, then you do not need to go to the 4 and 5 statement. It means program may also be completed. So after 5, so 6 is the node where program completes, right? 6 is the node where the program is completing. So this is the end node. So you will see that you will need to find out the cyclomatic complexity of this. Cyclomatic complexity of this particular graph will be very simple. First thing is you can find out the number of regions. So this is one region, this is second region, and the outer region is the third region, that is the unbounded region. So there are 3 regions in this graph. That means cyclomatic complexity is 3. Second method is you can count number of edges, that is 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. So the number of edges in this graph is 7, and number of nodes in this graph is 4 plus 2 is 6. Number of nodes are 6. So you can apply your formula, that is e minus n plus 2, that is 7 minus 6 plus 2, then also you will getting 3. Or you can apply the third method, and the third method is you can count the number of predicate nodes, that is number of conditional nodes. So 1 is a conditional node because there are 2 branches going. 3 is also a conditional node because there are 2 branches going, right? So there are p equals to, there are 2 predicate nodes. So p plus 1 is the cyclomatic complexity, that is 3. Again you are getting the same answer. So for this question, answer is option 3. Now let us see the next question in this series. They are asking how many nodes are there in the longest independent path. So longest independent path is which is starting from any node and covering a maximum number of nodes on the way. So for example, if you need to find out the longest path to reach the end. So for example, if I start with 1 and I need to cover the maximum number of nodes on the way. So 1 2 2 3, that is 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then again go to 1, that is 6, and then again from 1 to 11, that is 7. So we are getting 7 nodes in the in this path. That is from 1 I am going to the node number 2 3, then from 2 3 I am going to 6, then from 6 I am going to, let us say I can go to 7 or I can go to 8, does not matter. So I am going to, let us say 8, then 9, then 10. From 10 I am going to 1 again, then 1 to 11. So number of nodes in this independent path is 1 2 3, that is 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, right? 1 2. So 1 is I am visiting again, so 1 is not counting twice, that is we are having total number of, we need to find out the total number of edges in the path. So this is 1 edge, second edge, third edge, fourth edge, fifth edge, sixth edge, then this is the 7th edge. So there are 7 edges in this independent path. Can we find any path which is longer than this? So if we start, so either I can go from 1 to 11, so that will be the shortest path actually. Or what else we can do? So we can go from 1 to 2 3, then 2 3 to 6. So 1 2 3 4 5, then we can go to again 1 6, then 7, then 8. Okay, so this will also be a longest path. Then so this will be a longest path, right? So I think we can find out a path which is of length 8. Now how many predicate nodes are there in the graph and what are their names? So we can see that there are three predicate nodes, sorry, two predicate nodes. That is, this one is a predicate node and this one is a predicate node. So there are two predicate nodes and this one is also a predicate node 1. That are three predicate nodes, because from 1 we have two branches, that is 1 to 2 3 and then 1 to 11. So there are two branches going from 1. So 1 is a predicate node, 2 3 is also a predicate node, and 6 is also a predicate node. These are the three predicate nodes in this graph. So there are three predicate nodes, that is 1 2 3 and 6. These are the predicate nodes we have. How many regions are there in the flow graph? That we have already found out. Number of regions in this graph is 1. This is the second region, this is the third region, and this is the fourth, that is unbounded region. So there are total 4 regions in this graph. Very simple question. Next is, how many nodes are there in the flow graph? Very simple question. Number of nodes, that is 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9. There are 9 nodes in this graph, right? So next 5 questions are on DBMS, and we are given a relation in which we have 5 attributes, that is A B C D E, and the set of functional dependencies given, which is having 5 functional dependencies, 4 functional dependencies. First question is asking, we need to find out the minimal cover f dash of the functional dependencies. So let us see how to find out the minimal cover that we have already covered in our lectures in DBMS. So set of functional dependencies, we have A tends to BC, then D tends to E, and then BC tends to D and A tends to D. So in minimal cover, what we try to do is we try to reduce the functional dependencies. That means we try to remove the redundant functional dependencies. Can we remove any functional dependencies from this? There is a process of finding out the minimal cover. The step 1 is, first you try to minimize the right hand side. Minimizing the right hand side means that if there are two attributes on the right hand side of any functional dependency, just decompose them. Decomposition rule says that if you have A tends to BC, you can write it as A tends to B and A tends to C. This is your decomposition rule. Okay, and then we have a union rule. What union rule says? That union rule says the different opposite of this. It says that if you have A tends to B and A tends to C, you can combine them and you can write as A tends to BC. So we have only one functional dependency in which we have two attributes on the right hand side, so we will decompose it as A tends to B and A tends to C. Then we have D tends to E, then we have BC tends to D, and then A tends to D. Then second step says that try to minimize the left hand side. If there are two attributes on the left hand side of any functional dependency, see if you can remove any of the attributes. How we can remove that attribute is, what we need to do is we need to check, can we derive D only from B or can we derive D only from C? So for how we will check that, what we need to do is we need to take the closure of B. If in the closure of B D comes, that means B can determine D, right? So the closure of B will give you only B because there is nothing determined from B. And if you take the closure of D, from the closure of D, what you can determine? From D you can determine only E, that is DE. Sorry, we need to take the closure of C. So C closure. In the C closure, that means what you can determine from C. From C you can determine only C. That means none of them can be removed because none of them alone can determine D. So this we cannot minimize any of these. So that means after the second step also we will have A tends to B, A tends to C, D tends to E, then BC tends to D, and then A tends to D. Okay, so these are the functional dependencies now we have. Now the third step is to find out, can we remove any functional dependency? How we will check that? So what we can do is to check whether we can remove any functional dependency. We need to take a functional dependency and we need to see can we determine that functional dependency from other set of functional dependencies. What I mean to say is, let us say we have a tends to d. Okay, so we need to check can we determine from a to d without this functional dependency. So if you see the closure of a, the closure of a will be from a you can determine a, you can determine b, and you can determine c. Okay, so from a you can determine a b c. We do not need to consider this because we are trying to remove this, we will not consider this one. So from a we can determine a b c. That means d is not coming in the closure of a, that means this cannot be removed, right? Then we will see can we derive e from any other function. So if we try to remove, let us say a tends to c, we need to check can we derive a tends to c without this functional dependency. So if we remove this functional dependency, then from a closure we will get a tends to b, so we'll get a b, and from a we are getting d, right? And from d we are getting e, so we can get a b d e. From a can we get a tends to c? So we are not getting a tends to c, right? So this functional dependency can also not be removed. So if we check d tends to e, can we remove d tends to e? For that we need to take the closure of d and we need to check what we are getting in the closure of d. So in the closure of d we are getting only d, right? So this means this functional dependency can also not be removed because we are not getting e in the closure of d without this functional dependency. So we like this you can try for other attributes like b and c, and from b you will get only b and from c you will get only c. That means none of them can be removed at this particular stage. Step 4 will be we will try to check is there any functional dependency which is coming due to the rule of transitivity. Is there any functional dependency which is coming due to transitivity? So let us see that. So we have a tends to b and a tends to c, so we are getting a tends to bc, right? So we have a tends to bc and we have bc tends to d. So we have bc tends to d also. You will see that according to the rule of transitivity, if a tends to bc and bc tends to d, we can say that a tends to d will also be there. So you can see that this functional dependency is coming due to transitivity, so this can be removed from this set. That means after removing this functional dependency you will get a tends to b, c, and then we will get d tends to e and bc tends to d. These will be the set of functional dependencies after minimal cover. This means that this functional dependency is redundant, we can remove this functional dependency. So the minimal cover will be a tends to b, a tends to c, bc tends to d, and d tends to e. That is right. So what is the problem here? We have a tends to bc, we have b tends to d, so this is wrong. A tends to b, a tends to c, a tends to d, this is wrong because a tends to d is removed. A tends to b, a tends to c, b tends to d, c tends to d, we do not have any functional dependency like this. So option 1 is the right answer. Now this is asking identify the keys of the relation R. Okay, so the very good method of finding out the keys of the relation is that you check the so how to start, right? How to start checking for the primary key. The trick is that you take one attribute which is not in the right hand side of any functional dependency. You see a is not in the right hand side of any functional dependency, right? So b is also there, c is also there, d is also there, but a is not in the right hand side, so a will always be in the primary key or candidate keys. Now see what you will getting from a closure. From a you are getting a, from a you are getting bc, from bc what you can get d, and from d you can get e. That means from a we are getting all the attributes. A can determine all the attributes of the relation R. That means a is the key of the relation R, and there is not other key, there is only one key, that is a, because a is not in the right hand side of any functional dependency, so a cannot be replaced by any other attributes. Now the question number 98 is we are given two relations and with the functional dependencies. They are asking which of the following is true with respect to the given decomposition. So what we have done is we had the original relation R in which we had attributes a, b, c, d, e, and there were some functional dependencies. We have divided this relation into two sub relations, that is R1, and R1 is having a, b, c, and then R2 which is having ADE. So we need to check whether they are dependency preserving and lossless or not. The functional dependencies in the relation R1 is A tends to B and B tends to C. They are given, right? So let's call this set func F1. A tends to B and A tends to C. So this is A tends to C. And the second set of functional dependencies, A tends to D and D tends to E. A tends to D and D tends to E. So first, to check for lossless, if it is lossless or lossy, what you will do is you will take the intersection of the attributes of the relation R1 and R2. You will see what is the common attribute. So if you take the intersection of the attributes, the common attribute is A in both relations. Right now you check, is A key of relation R1 or R2? Is this the key of any of these relation? How you will check that? If it can determine either all the attributes of this relation or this relation. So you will see that A is determining ABC, right? And it is also determining DE. That means A is the key of both relations. That is definitely lossless joint decomposition. This decomposition is definitely lossless because A is key of R1 and R2 both. If it is a key of at least one relation, then it is lossless. Now check for dependency preserving. How do we check for dependency preserving? So we are given A tends to B, A tends to C, and A tends to D, D tends to E. What is the original functional dependency set? The original functional dependency set was A tends to BC, BC tends to D, and then we had D tends to E, I think. So D tends to E, BC tends to D, and A tends to D. So this was the original set of functional dependencies. You see A tends to B and A tends to C, that is A tends to BC. This is directly preserved from the relation R1. So A tends to BC. So we will check one by one. A tends to BC is preserved from the relation R1. Now A tends to D and D tends to E. That means A tends to D is also preserved. A tends to D is also preserved. And you will see that D tends to E is also preserved. Now the question is about BC tends to D, right? So BC tends to D, how we can check whether this functional dependency is preserved or not? What we need to do is we need to check if BC tends to D is preserved it belongs to this particular set or not. For that we will use the membership algorithm. We need to check whether BC tends to D is preserved or not. How we will check that? Just take the closure of BC from this set, okay, and you will check that if you will take the closure of BC from this relation, you will check that BC will give you only BC, right? So that means BC is not implying D. This means that this simply means that BC tends to D is not preserved. BC tends to D is not preserved. This means that this decomposition is not dependency preservation. This decomposition was not dependency preserving. Okay, not dependency preserving. That means first option is false. First option is saying that it is dependency preserving, right? It is false. Now let us check R1 R2 is in 2NF or 3NF. How we will check that? So first let's check for 2NF. So R1 relation is, in the R1 relation we have the functional dependencies A tends to B and A tends to C. Okay, and the key in this relation is A. You can see that the key of the relation is A. Your 2NF says that there should not be any partial dependency. Okay, 2NF says that there should not be partial dependency. Partial dependency means that if proper subset of candidate key implies any non-key attributes, okay, or you can say prime attribute implies non-key attribute. Because key is not a composite key, it is not a composite key, it is a simple key, so there is no subset, right? There is no subset of A. Subset of A can only be empty or A. For example, the subset of BC can be B or it can be C, but subset of one attribute cannot be anything, it can be itself. So that means there is no possibility of partial dependency. No possibility of partial dependency means that it is in 2NF. Check for 3NF. If we check for 3NF, 3NF says that either left hand side should be a super key. If we have a functional dependency like this, either left hand side should be a super key or right hand side should be a prime attribute. And we can see that in both of the functional dependencies, left hand side is a super key. Okay, do not be confused about super key. Every primary key is a candidate key and every candidate key is a super key. So that means every candidate key is a super key, means that A is also a super key. A is super key, candidate key and primary key all. So A is a super key and A is super key. In both of the functional dependencies, left hand side is a super key. That means the first relation R1 is in 3NF. Okay, it is also in 2NF and 3NF. But the stronger normal form is 3NF. So we will say that R1 is in the 3NF because every relation which is in 3NF is also in 2NF. So stronger answer will be 3NF. Check for the relation of R2. So R2 relation is given, that is A tends to D and D tends to E. Okay, A tends to D and D tends to E. You will see that the key of this relation is also A, right? Key of this relation is A. So A is only the prime attribute because A can imply D, E. A, D, E, all things are implied by A. So first check for 2NF. 2NF check says that there should not be any partial dependency. There is no possibility of partial dependency because there is only one prime attribute and which is a simple key. So this is okay, this is also okay. That means the relation is in 2NF. If we check for 3NF, 3NF says that either left hand side should be a super key, that is fine. But in this functional dependency, you will see that the left hand side is not a super key and right hand side is also not a prime attribute. So it is not in 3NF. So the answer is the relation R1 is in 3NF and R2 is in 2NF. R1 is in 3NF and R2 is in 2NF. So option 4 is the right answer for this question. Now question number 99, it says that identify the redundant functional dependency that we have already find out when we checked for minimal cover. So in the minimal cover we have removed A tends to D, that is the redundant functional dependency, that is option 3 is the right answer. Now the last question is identify the normal form in which the relation R belongs, the original relation they are talking about. So the set of functional dependency in the original relation was A tends to BC, then D tends to E, BC tends to D, and A tends to D. And we have already found out that the key for this relation is A because A can determine all the attributes, that is A, B, C, and there is no other key. There is no other key in this relation. If there is no other key in this relation, this means that the relation cannot be in BCNF or it cannot be in 3NF. So relation will only be in 2NF and there is no possibility of partial dependency. There you do not need to solve this question because if you have done enough practice of normalization, then you will look at the relation and you will directly say that the relation is in 2NF because BCNF says that in all the functional dependencies the left hand side should be a super key or you can say candidate key. What 3NF says is that if you have functional dependency alpha tends to beta, then either left hand side should be a super key or right hand side should be a prime attribute. Prime attribute means the part of candidate key, right? And 2NF says that there should not be any partial dependency. No partial dependency means that what is the meaning of partial dependency? That is, if we have any functional dependency like this, then if alpha is a prime attribute and beta is a non-key attribute, this kind of functional dependency is called as partial dependency. For example, let us say in a relation the key is BC and let us say non-key attribute is D. So if we have C tends to D, this functional dependency is called as partial dependency because B is a prime attribute, C is a prime attribute and C is a proper subset of this key and D is a non-key. So proper subset of candidate key implies non-key attribute, that is called as partial dependency. In this you will see that in this left hand side is a super key, so BCNF satisfied by this functional dependency. But in this case left hand side is not a super key, this means that BCNF is not satisfied. 3NF Same thing, this is okay, but in this neither left hand side is a super key nor right hand side is a prime attribute. It is satisfying 2NF because there is no partial dependency in this relation, right? So the relation satisfies 2NF, that is second normal form. This was the last question from NTNet December 2019. Next we will start NTNet 2019 June paper. Okay, June paper 2. So thank you for watching this video. Give a like and comment your favorite explanation, and if there is any mistake in the answer of any question, you can comment, and you can give your feedbacks on the comment box. Thank you.